Been a while since we've done this, huh? Let's shake off the rust together. Omni-Man vs. Bardock is Death Battle's first episode as an independent production, a fact which makes it worth appreciating just for that. I was so happy to see the community rally around the Death Battle team with the Kickstarter campaign, and I couldn't be happier to have the show already be back in action. In fact, we're already back to such a state of normalcy that the latest episode has triggered a huge wave of controversy with the outcome alone. Some things really never change, do they? But while I can appreciate the comedy in the situation that followed Omni-Man Bardock's release, I also feel the need to say that some people have gone to rather alarming extremes over the results. You have the right to be upset when your preferred character loses, but harassing the crew and wishing harm on them is not and will never be an acceptable way of expressing that. And if I'm being entirely honest, it just makes you look ridiculous. Oh, boo-hoo-hoo, my favorite Saiyans are dead. Oh, I don't care if it's mean. Everybody's got dead characters. That's no excuse to be horrible to real, hardworking people. Now, obviously that's only directed at the actual bad actors who are being shitty over this episode. If you're just someone who disagrees with the outcome or how some feats were measured, that's fine as long as you're civil about it. Death Battle is like any show in that it can always benefit from good faith criticism, and as someone who wants to see the show continue to grow, I'm happy to offer that kind of feedback. I will insist on the civility aspect as far as my channel is concerned though, so all you knuckleheads in the comments better watch your tones. With all that out of the way, let's get to the actual review. Before I get to the meat and potatoes of these rundowns, let's point out the most obvious change from Rooster Teeth era Death Battle: the lack of animated host segments. Their absence isn't too surprising considering their limited budget and no longer having the same animators in-house. It felt weird to not see them after so many seasons of the show where they were always there, but I wouldn't say their absence here takes away from the experience. They've never been integral to Death Battle in my opinion, since we can still have fun whiz and boomstick banter without it needing to be animated. I'd be glad to see these segments return in whatever form is manageable for the team, but for now, I'm not super bothered by the lack of them. Now for the rundowns themselves, which start off by covering Omni-Man. This definitely feels distinct from what he was given against Homelander, with more cosmic feats and story stuff that wasn't just from season 1 of the Invincible show. Just because it has an identity of its own doesn't necessarily mean I think it's better than Nolan's first analysis though. I feel like they spend too much time going over what Viltrumites can do, leaving next to no room for Omni-Man's character to be discussed. Once they get past his task on Earth, it's non-stop feats and abilities right up to the end, with only a few scraps of story sprinkled in there. To be fair, I completely understand why they needed to fit all of this stuff in. People were going to need some serious convincing if they were to accept Omni-Man winning, and it's no coincidence that just about everything they mentioned in his rundown comes back in the results. Thing is though, people still weren't convinced, and I'd chalk that up to the episode not explaining itself as well as it could have, but we'll get more into that later. My point here is that Omni-Man's rundown, while being solid on the whole, just needed more room to breathe in more ways than one. The big feats for Nolan needed more elaboration in order to ward off doubts from the audience, and the character discussion needed more room to exist, really. I've heard in the past that Omni-Man's first analysis felt like it was trying too hard to not spoil anything past the first season of the show. Well, speaking as someone who's only semi-aware of the show's contents, this second rundown feels like it doesn't even have the time to get into anything past its second season. We get his new bug family, his desire to see if he can be a good father despite his past, and not much else. There's been so little established about the series here that when they mentioned the coalition of planets in the verdict, I was left asking, what the hell is that? Maybe that's just a me problem, but I think a good Death Battle analysis should leave you informed not just about a character, but also about where they fit into the universe they inhabit. And I can't say this second bit of Omni-Man coverage did that for me. Onto Bardock's analysis now, which I feel did a much better job at incorporating both his story and versus stuff. By focusing on an era of history that predates the universe shockwave chicanery we've all grown numb to, it manages to set itself apart from other Dragon Ball rundowns. I enjoyed learning about Saiyan culture from before they were wiped out, and information about the Great Ape form and Goku's space travel feat were also fun to digest. The ending section about Super Saiyan Bardock hits especially hard, making it a pretty easy pick for my favorite part of this episode's rundowns. The comparisons they draw between his journey and Goku's, both verbally verbally and visually are really striking, and they add a layer of personal depth to the form that you don't hear about as much nowadays. Not much more to say beyond that, I think. I know I went on about Omni-Man's rundown for a lot longer, but that's mainly because I think its issues are fairly nuanced relative to the creative process behind Death Battle. Bardock's doesn't have anything super complex to get into by comparison. It's just really good, and I quite enjoyed it. But one element these analyses definitely have in common is that they're both fantastically edited. DJ and Max are back like the show never left on this episode, with the former doing Omni-Man's rundown and the latter handling Bardock's. There's a plethora of awesome motion graphics and visual tricks to look at throughout, making this a strong return to form for both of them. And that's to say nothing of the great sound effects and music choices also on display. It's top shelf stuff from start to finish. I'm glad to see the gap between this and Season 10 hasn't slowed them down at all. Overall, I'd say this episode's analysis portion is pretty good. Omni-Man's is flawed, though definitely still enjoyable, and Bardock's is refreshingly good, making the build-up to this episode's battle plenty of fun to sit through. I wouldn't go so far as to call them outstanding, but for the show's first independent production, they're for sure ones to be proud of. And so we come to the animation, which is equally deserving of such pride. It's remarkable that even now that they're on their own with production, the crew is still able to put out a fight that stands on par with the previous year's showings. I'm very glad to see that be the case, especially since it means I have plenty to go over when analyzing all the good stuff here. So without any further ado, let's do just that. First on the docket is the animation quality itself, and it's no surprise that it turned out spectacular. Devil Artemis is a force to be reckoned with in the visual department, and he made all the combat here fast, fluid, easy to follow, and cinematic. The models are clean, the effects are on point, and the fight generally looks very polished, so I've got very little to complain about there. The voice actors did their jobs excellently as well. Tom Schalk reprises his role as Omni-Man for this fight, and it's great to see him come back for a performance that allows for much more range than vs. Homelander did. From the intimidating moments to the high energy climax, he nails every line, with it all adding up to another great showing from him on Death Battle. Bardock, meanwhile, is also voiced by a returning face, that being Cameron Nicod. I'll be honest, I sometimes forget how much range he has, because you'd never convince me this was the same guy who voiced Mario back in Season 5 without the credits to prove it. Regardless, he also brought his A game here, bringing the low-class warrior to life in a way that sells his fighting spirit and his Saiyan pride in equal measure. And lastly, there's the soundtrack. Solid State Invincible. Man, Omni-Man cannot get a song title that doesn't take 3 business days to say out loud, huh? Well, that aside, this song is a fucking jam and a half. It works in leitmotifs from Bardock's theme very naturally while taking heavy inspiration from Diabolical Invincible Me, even managing to put a cool spin on the latter song's lyrics and tone. Where that track was heavy, imposing, and very in your face with how merciless the fighters in its episode were, this one feels more reflective, remorseful, and even triumphant. Omni-Man's guilt over his past sins and Bardock's drive to rise above his station are reflected in the lyrics, and even the repeated use of "give up" adds to this. I think it reflects Omni-Man's desire to be more than a murderer, hoping Bardock will retreat and leave Thraxa be without having to use lethal force. Overall, this is a really solid fight track, adding to the battle while being a fun listen in its own right. With that, we can get to breaking down this fight. I'll do my best to make this not too long, since I want to discuss the verdict in detail without making this video a chore to sit through. We open on a Saiyan attack ball descending toward the planet Thraxa, crash landing in the middle of a large city with explosive results. As a warning siren rings out in the air, the transport is unsealed and Bardock emerges from it. He drops an annoyed line that I think is referencing Arlia, another bug planet that was destroyed by Vegeta, and once he leaves his pod, he barely has time to enable his scouter before Omni-Man throws a sucker punch from behind. This is followed by back-to-back Mortal Kombat references, with their arm clash and Nolan's subsequent punch being references to how matches start in MK1. This is doubly clear in the storyboards, where Omni-Man mimics his intro animation exactly, making for a neat reference to start this fight off. Nolan declares that Thraxa isn't anyone's to conquer, calling back to when he fended off that alien invasion while also solidifying that that this is Omni-Man at a very different stage of his arc than we saw against Homelander. Bardock's not deterred though, retaliating with a strike that knocks Nolan into the sky before channeling his ki and pressing his advantage. This leads to that bit of combat we saw in the Kickstarter reveal, which I don't have much to say about besides it being good. After Bardock knocks him away, Nolan proceeds to allude to Mark in reference to the Saiyan being in over his head with his invasion of the planet. This would be a fun nod on its own, but it's made better by Bardock replying bluntly that his son would kick Mark's ass, which makes for a cute flip on the "my dad could beat up your dad" trope. Also, Bardock's claim has been fact-checked by real Saiyan patriots, and yeah, he's definitely not wrong. You could take that meme of a debilitated Goku versus full power Naruto and swap in Mark without the result changing at all. Bro would still get turned into paste. Such an outcome won't come as easily for Bardock though, since a hefty blast of ki doesn't even scratch Omni-Man's defenses. Bardock follows up on this with yet more ki attacks, which Nolan flies through and past to get at the Saiyan's attack ball. He throws it at Bardock to create a momentary distraction, giving him an opening to finally land a solid hit. I like how this interaction pairs nicely with the results, as Nolan is forced to rely on his greater combat experience in order to work around Bardock's greater versatility with ranged attacks. That's something the rest of the fight succeeds at too, since despite Bardock generally being able to outspeed Omni-Man and get the jump on him, his attacks aren't able to do much until he's at his absolute strongest. Likewise, Nolan has to fight smarter rather than harder to compensate for his lower speed, and what few hits he does land are more than enough to level the playing field. That much is clear from the aftermath of Nolan's attack here. Bardock is left lying in a crater on the ground, bloodied and battered as his Viltrumite foe looms overhead. He doesn't even get a chance to recover before Omni-Man stomps down on his arm, jamming his flesh into the metal rubble of his transport pod. As if that weren't enough, he then calls Bardock an embarrassment, which has such a good line read from Tom Schalk. I agree with the consensus that most of the dialogue here isn't as instantly memorable as Omnilander's best quotes, but damn if the voice actors didn't come through to make some of the ones on offer here stick in my mind. This one is especially good. The amount of disappointed father energy it carries is pitch perfect. Of course, this insult sets off Bardock's pride, and he declares that Omni-Man hasn't seen the Saiyan's true power yet as the full moon's light shines down from above. Bathed in its glow, Bardock assumes his great ape form with a mighty roar, making for a pretty cool transformation scene with dialogue that sets up later interactions in the fight. There's stuff to nitpick for sure, like the scene where Bardock's head meets his neck being see-through here, but it's a momentary blip in the immersion of an otherwise solid sequence. Omni-Man keeps talking down to Bardock after he goes big monkey mode, but all the response he gets now is a giant hairy fist in his direction. He manages to evade, only for Bardock to outmaneuver him in turn and start firing his laser! I love how they did the sound design on Bardock's mouth laser here. Between the blast itself and his feral roar, the attack in general feels super weighty and powerful. This impact frame in particular also goes hard. We love a good kick-ass impact frame around here. After a good few instant transmission attacks from Great Ape Bardock, Omni-Man composes himself again, still no worse for wear even after such an assault. Not even Bardock's crushing grip can restrain him for long, and he decks the Great Ape across the face, only to get swatted by Bardock's tail in return. This, of course, leads to Nolan grabbing said tail and so longe Bowsering Bardock into the sky, ripping his tail clean off in the process. I think we all expected something like this to happen, so Bardock would be out of the Ozaru form for the final act. But the ease with which it happens and Nolan's following reaction add a bit of levity to it. It's like even he's surprised by how easily it came off, making for another demonstration of the difference in power between them. Bardock is shocked too, but his own tail swinging toward him leaves him with no time to recover, and Omni-Man knocks him clean into outer space with it. This is a pretty funny scene, though I've heard people say that where the tail is coming from seems to shift abruptly between shots. It does seem like Omni-Man was much higher than he is when he appears in front of Bardock, but I'm personally not too bothered by it. In my mind's eye, I can explain it away with Omni-Man just ducking down mid-swing while we're seeing Bardock's reaction. Anyway, we're in space now, and Nolan is choking Bardock out in front of this super pretty blue star. It's looking pretty bad for the low-class Saiyan, since he's pretty beat up and Omni-Man has barely broken a sweat. But he refuses to give up, declaring that his sons still need him as his hair begins to glow. With a badass flip on Goku's powering up line against Beerus, Bardock unlocks his kind's true potential and goes Super Saiyan. It might not have a lot of competition, considering the last episode to treat base Super Saiyan as a big deal was the original Goku vs. Superman 11 years ago, but this is hands down the best Super Saiyan transformation we've seen on Death Battle. From Nikad's performance to the effects of the transformation to how quickly he starts beating Nolan's ass with it, it leaves its mark on the viewer pretty much instantly. I love how the music works in tandem with it too, bringing back the solid state Scouter leitmotif but with triumphant horns instead of a basic synth to really sell how huge this is for Bardock's character. It's huge for the fight as well, because Bardock instantly starts drawing blood, savaging Omni-Man with a flurry of blows that culminate with a huge beam of ki energy. And even though Nolan doesn't have a cool transformation to undergo, he more than makes up for it with this pulse-pounding scene where he blocks the ki blast. I cannot get enough of this moment. Between the music being perfectly timed with the impact, the sound effects cutting out just before the impact, and Omni-Man's guttural roar as he overpowers the attack and throws it over his head. It's fucking flawlessly executed, and it shows that Omni-Man is finally having to give it his all, just like Bardock is. Now, for as stellar as this final act has been so far, I do unfortunately have to pump the brakes a bit, because beyond this point is where I have some criticisms with this fight's ending. The split shots of them rushing toward each other are good, but after that it's one solid clash, one whiffed punch, and one kick to the face before Nolan is suddenly shouting at the top of his lungs and delivering the killing blow. I do like Shulk's delivery of the line, and the killing blow itself is cool, but there's a very jarring sense of escalation here. It feels like there's a solid few seconds of no-holds-barred scrapping missing from this ending, and in fact, there actually are. If you check out the storyboards for this episode, you can see that after Nolan rushes in following the ki blast, he's forced to endure another barrage of strikes before he and Bardock start full-force headbutting each other. It's after this very bloody exchange that the final blow happens, and you can really feel how much Omni-Man and Bardock are losing themselves to the bloodlust and adrenaline pumping through them here. It might seem like a small exclusion from the finished fight, but without it, I don't feel like Nolan throwing away his desire to be more than a killer in order to finally finish off Bardock is quite so earned. It's that subtle but necessary distinction between giving it his all and losing himself in the thrill of battle which I feel is missing, and that kind of undermines the notion I touched on before of Omni-Man purposefully avoiding lethal force. Keep in mind that the scene didn't have to play out exactly like the boards in order to fix this issue. Just making that final scuffle more drawn out in general, showing Nolan coming undone and forgetting his own strength more organically would have been enough. As is, it definitely felt like it was being hurried toward that final clash, which weakens this conclusion a fair bit for me. But regardless, they trade their final pair of blows, and the force is enough to blow Bardock's forearm into gory bits. The light of Super Saiyan is gone, his stamina spent, and with the last of his energy, he tells Nolan to remember the name of Saiyan, the supposedly low-class embarrassment of a species that was able to push him this far. With that, Bardock is fully depleted, and he allows the gravity of the star to pull him in as his life drains away. I appreciate the choice to make Bardock's death more soft-spoken after how high energy this whole battle has been, though it's slightly undercut by how long it takes for Nolan to drop his quirky-ass F-bomb at the end. I get why it's here, it reinforces how Omni-Man didn't want it to end like this, but there's so much dead air between Bardock's parting words and Nolan's response that the timing verges on comedic. And that's Omni-Man vs. Bardock's fight in its entirety talked about. As a complete package, it's not without stuff I can find issues with, but all things considered, I'd say it's a very good animation. I think it marked a good starting point for Death Battle's independent journey, something I'm sure the 20,000 or so dislikes on the episode would care to disagree with. And that brings us to the real hot topic of this episode, the verdict. I'm not gonna beat around the bush with this. This conclusion is pretty rough around the edges. This mainly has to do with how they explained the strength comparison, which had a lot of critical context relegated to tabs or just left out when that info really needed to be outlined verbally. You know it's bad when Ben has to dedicate the last 10 minutes of the following Death Battle cast to justifying the outcome. Really, this just further adds to my stance that we need a Desk of Death Battle adjacent show that's fully dedicated to breaking down all the math and feats involved in each episode. In cases like this one where they just do not have room for all of the relevant context, it would go a long way toward heading off misinformed or bad-faith criticisms of the show's research. And I also just think it'd be fun to check out. Anyway, back on topic. Even in terms of what they do outline in the script, the wording of the results is just really clumsy in some areas. Like, they say the sun disk scaling puts it at 3 septillion tons, failing to mention that that figure is for its mass. That's made even more confusing when Boomstick's next line is still talking about the mass when the visuals are showing the figure that destroying it got, which is also not stated aloud. Also, I feel like the emphasis that was placed on the Viltrum bust ended up backfiring here, because a ton of people seized on that as a point of critique when it wasn't even the best feat they gave for Omni-Man's AP. Granted, part of that is just down to people not really listening to what the episode is saying, but they do spend way more time on the planet busting feat than the sun disk feat in Nolan's rundown, so maybe trimming that down and shifting some of the sun disk explanation from the results to the rundown would have helped it feel less like it came out of left field. I can see why they talked about the Viltrum bust so much. Like Ben said, it was to get people more comfortable with the idea of Viltrumites being on the same level as Saiyans. But to paraphrase his words, if the planet bust isn't really central to the argument the episode is making, then why spend so much time building it up compared to the feat that actually gives Omni-Man the win? Especially when giving that spotlight to the sun disk feat would have achieved the effect you were going for anyway. With all that being said, I don't have too much else to say about the results on this one. I enjoy the continued use of text bubbles to highlight which way the advantages broke in the final comparison, and outside of the strength difference, there's not much here that strikes me as controversial. I did like how the stamina drain of Super Saiyan played a major role. That almost feels like a non-factor in modern Dragon Ball fights. Not much more to say than that, really. Also, in place of the usual credits are lists of Kickstarter backers, and wouldn't you know it, I'm there. Feels cool to have my name attached to a Death Battle episode, especially without the catch that it would bind me to a sadistic dream demon for all time. Let me tell ya, sometimes the things you really want are just not worth the headache. On a completely unrelated note, the next episode is, or well, was Joker vs. Giorno. Yeah, I'm pretty late to the party here, so I'll be saving more of my thoughts on this matchup for when I get around to reviewing it in full. I hope you like how detailed my episode breakdowns tend to be, because for an episode that features the protagonist of one of my favorite video games of all time, yeah, I'm gonna be granular as fuck with this one. And I sure do have a lot to say, so stay tuned for that in the near future. For now though, let's wrap this one up. Omni-Man vs. Bardock definitely has its flaws as an episode, and even if I think the backlash is unwarranted, I'm not gonna deny people the right to disagree with it. But even with those flaws taken into account, I quite enjoyed this episode and consider it a good return to form for Death Battle. It's got 2 rundowns that range from passable to really good, and a fight that, while not better than Nolan's previous appearance, is a really fun watch that I get a lot of enjoyment out of. I'm feeling an 8 out of 10 for this one. I get the feeling that independent Death Battle is only going to get better from this starting point, and I can't wait to see what the team can achieve once they get to episodes they're having to make from scratch. And that'll do it for my first review of Death Battle's new era. I've got a lot to do if I want to keep up with the bangers that are dropping, so it's back to my hole for now. Until then, check out the reaction highlights for this episode, which are linked in the description like always. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you again soon in the next video.